You won't believe what happened when these two Karen sisters just kept driving right through my ranch lake property like it was their personal shortcut. At first, I thought maybe they didn't realize where they were going. Maybe they were lost or confused. But no, it quickly became clear they didn't care one bit about my property or the rules. Every time they came by, it was like a challenge, a little act of defiance that just kept pushing my patience to the limit. My ranch isn't just some random spot tits, a place I've worked hard to build, a place that means a lot to me. That lake on my property isn't just for show. It's part of my land, part of what I protect. So when those SUVs started tearing through the water and mud, it felt like a disrespectful invasion. I tried to ignore it at first, hoping they'd stop on their own. But they didn't. In fact, they seemed to get bolder every time, acting like it was their right to do whatever they wanted, no matter who it affected. I knew I had to do something. But I also knew this wasn't going to be a simple, please don't do that conversation. These sisters weren't just careless. They were reckless, and I had to make sure their SUV and, more importantly, them would regret driving through my land like that. What I did next was something I never thought I'd have to do. But it was necessary to protect what's mine. The tension built with every visit they made, and things were about to come to a head. What happened next? Well, that's a story you won't want to miss. Stay tuned, because this is just the beginning of a showdown that neither side will forget. These Karen sisters weren't strangers to the Vented neighborhood. I'd seen them around before, always driving their flashy SUV with that confident, almost arrogant look. You know the type, the kind who think rules don't apply to them, especially when it comes to someone else's land. But this was different. This wasn't just about a careless mistake or an accidental trespass. They seemed to be making a statement, cutting through my ranch lake like it was an open road, as if daring me to say something. My ranch isn't just any piece of land. It's been in my family for years, a place filled with memories and hard work. The lake itself is a big part of that. It's not just water, it's a boundary, a symbol of what's mine and what's off limits. So watching those tires splash through it again and again felt like a personal attack. I wasn't just worried about the damage to the environment or the property. It was the blatant disrespect that cut the deepest. I started talking to some neighbors, trying to get a sense if anyone else had problems with the sisters. Turns out they had a history of pushing boundaries, ignoring warnings, and leaving a mess behind wherever they went. It wasn't just my ranch they were disturbing. Other people nearby had their own stories, but no one had stood up to them yet. That's when I realized I couldn't just let this slide. If I didn't act, it would only get worse. But confronting them directly felt risky. These weren't people who backed down easily. I had to think smart, protect my land without escalating things too fast. Still, every time I saw their SUV approaching, my blood ran cold. I could feel the tension rising, like a storm about to break. What would happen when they came back? Would they finally stop, or was this just the start of something bigger? The answer was hanging in the air, and I knew I had to be ready. Every time I caught sight of their SUV rumbling down the dirt path toward my lake, a mix of frustration and determination settled in. It wasn't just about the property anymore, it felt personal. I started noticing small signs of their visits beyond the tracks in the mud. Broken branches near the edge of the lake, trash carelessly tossed to the side, even deep tire ruts cutting into the grass. It was clear they didn't care how much damage they were causing. This wasn't a simple mistake or an accidental detour. They were deliberately driving through my ranch lake property, like it was their playground. The more I watched, the more I realized this was about control, about them showing off and ignoring boundaries. I even overheard a conversation from a neighbor who'd spotted them bragging about it, laughing like it was some kind of game. That stung the most, knowing they saw my hard work as a joke. but I couldn't just lash out or make things worse by confronting them in anger. Meanwhile, there was another side to this story I hadn't expected. One afternoon, I spotted a local wildlife officer near the lake, checking out the tire tracks. Turns out their reckless driving wasn't just damaging. My property was disturbing nesting areas for some protected birds. That added a whole new layer to the conflict. Now, I wasn't just fighting to protect my land. I was standing up for the environment too. It felt like the stakes had suddenly doubled. But these Karen sisters weren't the only challenge. A few neighbors warned me that they had connections, people who might not take kindly to anyone who pushed back. I started wondering if I was getting myself into something bigger than just a property dispute. Still, I knew I couldn't back down. The tension was building, and every visit from their SUV felt like a countdown to an inevitable clash. What I did next to protect my ranch and stand my ground would change everything. But before that, there was still so much at risk, so many questions left unanswered. The days that followed felt like walking on a tightrope. Every time I heard the familiar roar of that SUV's engine, my heart would race, knowing those Karen sisters were back, ready to drive through my ranch lake property again without a care. I kept a close eye from the porch, watching as they made their usual reckless path, splashing through the water, ignoring every sign I'd put up, warning them to stay off the land. It was like they were daring me to do something, pushing my patience beyond what I thought I could handle. The damage was piling up fast, the muddy trails carved deeper, the broken branches littered the shoreline, and I could see the effects on the wildlife getting worse. The protected birds were restless, their nests disturbed, and it was breaking my heart to see the consequences of these sisters' actions. I wanted to believe they'd stop, that maybe a simple conversation or a warning would work, but every time they showed up, it was clear they had no intention of respecting the boundaries. Word was spreading in the neighborhood. Some neighbors offered quiet support, sharing stories of their own run-ins with these sisters, warning me about how far they might go. The tension was thick, and I started to feel the weight of the situation pressing down on me. It wasn't just about property anymore. It felt like a battle over respect, pride, and standing up for what's right. One evening, as the sun dipped low, I spotted the SUV coming again, headlights cutting through the dusk. I was ready this time. I had spent days preparing, thinking through every detail. But deep down, I knew this was more than just a showdown. It was a turning point. What happened next would decide everything, and there was no turning back. The question was, who would come out on top when the dust finally settled? Just when I thought I had everything under control, things took a sharp turn I never saw coming. As the SUV rolled up toward the lake that evening, I noticed something different. There was a second vehicle trailing behind them, something bigger and more intimidating. Suddenly, it wasn't just about the Karen sisters anymore. It felt like they had backup, like they were gearing up for a confrontation on their terms. The air grew heavier with every moment, the usual tension now mixed with a new, unsettling edge. I realized this wasn't just reckless driving or disrespect anymore. It was becoming a full-on power play. The sisters weren't just testing boundaries. They were trying to send a message, and the presence of that second vehicle made it clear. They were ready to escalate. My ranch lake property was turning into a battleground, and I had no idea how deep this was going to go. But the biggest shock came when a neighbor I trusted pulled me aside the next day. They told me the Karen sisters had been complaining to local officials, twisting the story to make it sound like I was the one causing trouble, trying to block access to what they called a public pathway. Suddenly, I was not just defending my land and the environment. I was fighting against a smear campaign that threatened to turn everyone against me. It was like the stakes had doubled overnight. Now, every step I took to protect my ranch felt like walking through a minefield. I knew I had to be careful, but the sisters seemed more determined than ever to push their luck. The question wasn't just about keeping them off my property anymore. It was about standing up to a fight that was bigger and more complicated than I ever imagined. The clock was ticking, and the next move could change everything. What would happen when these forces finally collided? The answer was coming fast, and it wasn't going to be easy. The day everything came to a head was one I'll never forget. As the Karen sisters' SUV rolled onto my Ranch Lake property again, with that second vehicle trailing behind, I was ready, but I knew this wasn't just going to be about blocking tires or warning signs anymore. This was the moment all the tension and frustration boiled over. I stood my ground by the edge of the lake, watching as they ignored every boundary, splashing through the water like they owned the place. But this time, I had a plan that would make sure they'd regret pushing me so far before they could make it through the shallow water. I activated a hidden gate I'd installed days earlier, blocking their path without any direct confrontation. Their SUV screeched to a halt, stuck in the mud, unable to move forward or back. The second vehicle stopped just behind them, and the sisters' confident smirks quickly faded into shock and frustration. Neighbors who had quietly supported me gathered around, watching the scene unfold. It was clear I wasn't alone in wanting to protect this land, as the sisters tried to figure out how to get their SUV free. The local wildlife officer I'd spoken with earlier arrived, documenting the damage and the restricted access, confirming my side of the story. The officers reminded the sisters about the protected land and the laws against trespassing, making it clear that this wasn't just a personal dispute, it was a legal issue. The Karen sisters' attempts to twist the story had fallen flat, and the pressure was finally on them. But just when I thought the battle was over, an unexpected twist hit. The second vehicle's driver stepped out into everyone's surprise. It was someone I'd never expected, a distant relative of the sisters who was actually on my side. They'd been trying to mediate quietly behind the scenes, hoping to avoid a fight, but when things escalated, decided to help me protect what mattered most. The tension broke, but the story wasn't over. What started as a fight over a lake had turned into something far bigger about family, respect, and standing up for what's right. And even though that day brought a kind of victory, I knew the real challenge was keeping it that way. After that intense day, things slowly started to calm down around my Ranch Lake property. The Karen sisters had no choice but to back off, stuck between the legal warnings and the unexpected support I received from their own relative. It was a relief to see that respect for my land and the environment was finally being acknowledged. The neighbors who had quietly watched from the sidelines now felt encouraged to speak up, and a sense of community began to rebuild around the property I cared so much about. The wildlife officer kept checking in, helping to monitor the area and making sure the protected birds and their nests were safe. That alone felt like a win, not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood and the natural life that depends on this land. It was a reminder that sometimes standing up isn't just about property lines or rules. It's about protecting something bigger than yourself. Looking back, this whole experience taught me a lot about boundaries, patience, and what it really means to stand your ground. The Karen sisters' reckless behavior tested me, but it also showed me the importance of being prepared and staying calm even when things get tough. More than anything, it reminded me how powerful it can be when a community comes together to protect what matters. Of course, the memory of those SUV tracks splashing through the lake will stick with me for a long time. But now, the lake is quiet again. The trails are healing, and the signs I put up are finally being respected. The Karen sisters may have started the trouble, but this land and everyone who loves it came out stronger in the end. Thanks for sticking with me through this story. If you ever face something like this, remember, protecting what's yours is worth every effort. And sometimes, the toughest battles bring the greatest rewards.